Where'd she go?
I probably drove her off.
Hmm. Oh, I know. I think she goes to the top. Yeah, she goes to the top. Hi, Lori.
Hi, how's everybody?
Mark is gonna recruit you.
Oh, I'm looking forward to Mark's session.
I've got Robert Metz raising his hand. Hi, Robert. Oops, he lowered his hand. Oh. Okay, what do you think? Want to get going?
You're all
Mark?
set to start. You're live on YouTube and you guys are all set.
Okay. Okay. Let me just get. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Jean Waterbury, and I'm the Director of Community and Regional Projects at the Tug Hill Commission in Watertown. Thank you for participating in tonight's webinar, all about open government issues in planning and zoning decisions. For this webinar, your video has been turned off and you are muted. Please ask questions in the chat box and we will answer them as we go or toward the end of the training. I see that a number of participants are from outside the Tug Hill region. Welcome. We're glad you're here because the topic of open government is certainly relevant to all levels of government throughout the state. For those of you who may not know, the Tug Hill region covers 2,100 square miles and covers portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. We are a small, non-regulatory New York State agency that provides technical assistance in the program areas of land use planning, community and economic development, and natural resource management. Our speaker tonight is Mark Shatner, Senior Principal Attorney of Miller, Mannix, Shatner, and Hefner in Glens Falls and Round Lake. While the firm maintains a general practice of law, Mark's efforts are concentrated in the areas of municipal, environmental, land use, planning, and zoning law. Mark and his colleagues represent approximately 24 municipalities in Essex, Franklin, Fulton, Hamilton, Herkimer, Saratoga, Warren, and Washington counties. That's a big region. He also serves as counsel to the Adirondack Association of Towns and Villages and several other local government related agencies in the area. Mr. Shatner is a graduate of Brown University and Boston University School of Law. He has lectured about municipal, environmental, planning, and zoning law matters, at numerous conferences throughout the state. He is a vice president of the New York Planning Federation and a frequent presenter at the Tug Hill Commission annual conference. The Tug Hill Commission would like to thank Mark for agreeing to do this session tonight. Again, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you have, and we will get to them either during the webinar or at the end. We hope you find this presentation informative, and with that, I will turn it over to Mark to get the webinar started. Mark?
Okay, very good. Thanks, Jean.
Mhm.
Good evening, everybody. Jean introduced me very nicely. I appreciate that. So I'm not going to harp on any aspects of my background, other than to say that some might consider me not very experienced because I've been doing what I do for less than 40 years. However, it's only a tiny bit less than 40 years. So I would suggest I actually have been around the block many times. I used to keep track of how many planning and zoning meetings I had attended. And when that number crossed 2,000, and this was quite a few years ago, I decided that it was an incredibly unhealthy practice to keep track. So I stopped doing it. But I've been around the block. I'm closing in on my 200th presentation or training session in those years. And of course, virtual, it's only been maybe my 10th or so. Anyone who has been to any of my prior training sessions knows that at the beginning, I like to take a survey to see to whom I'm speaking, where you're from, whether you're a planning board member, a ZBA member, whether you're connected with a city, a town, a village, a county, or whatever. For obvious reasons, one of the numerous ways in which COVID era presentations are different than before, it's real hard for me to take that survey, so I'm not going to do that. Other things that are different in virtual presentations are, we usually say things like, well, there's no smoking. I guess where you all are, smoke if you want. We talk about emergency exits. We're not going to do that. We get upset if the cell phone rings in the big auditorium and everyone's distracted. You all can do whatever you want to do. That's the wonders of modern technology. We are going to encourage questions and comments. And I think that Jean's going to try and Jennifer are going to try to monitor those during the session so that as long as you're asking or commenting on something that's what we're talking about at that moment, we're going to try to promote interrupting me, because my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that regardless of how knowledgeable somebody is, and I hope I am, hearing one person drone on for an hour just is not the most interesting way to take in information. I think that the way you're going to ask those questions or make those comments initially is by typing them in as chat. And then when we get at the end of the hour, I'm happy to stick around for 10 or 15 more minutes. And I think we can unmute people if they want to jump in verbally. And that would be actually my preference. If we do that, when you do that, I'm going to ask you to identify yourself and also just tell me where you're from, because I'm always interested to know where people are from in the state. This is the speed at which I normally present, although trust me, I can do it twice as fast, 3 times as fast, and 4 times as fast. This is also the volume that I usually speak at least via Zoom. And very, very importantly, I'm going to tell you right at the get-go, if I'm going way too fast, way too slow, or if I'm yelling at you, please type in there, stop yelling at us. I don't mean to be. I'm just making sure people hear me, if possible. I'm going to go through the game plan in just a minute. But before I do, I will preempt and jump ahead and save anybody from having to ask the most important question by far clearly is, which is, for any of you who know me, this is not my usual facial hair situation. This is, in fact, yes, this is a COVID beard. Although I normally have a beard, it does not look anything like the Rip Van Winkle ZZ Top goal I'm doing now. I have 1 more week till I shave it, and I just saved anybody the embarrassment of having to ask about my COVID beard. So what I thought I'd do is go through the game plan outline of what we might talk about. And I say might talk about because I'm going to throw all, I guess I have 9 or so topics. I'm going to throw them all out right now with a very, very terse, brief description of each as a foreshadowing, as a laying the game plan for the things we might talk about. We're then going to start talking about them. Some we may get to, some we may not, or some we will get to, clearly. Some we may not get to. I'm going to try to emphasize the ones that I perceive to be the most hot button items that I get asked the most questions about. I could be on target, I could be right on target, I could be partially on target, I could be way off base. So if about halftime or so, you see that there's something on the outline that we haven't gotten to and you think it's really important to do so, feel free to write, to type that in and we'll make sure I'll see that. And if we're going to get to it, I'll tell you that. If we're not going to get to it, I'll tell you why. And we can still talk about it in a less group fashion at the end of the hour if people like. So that's how I'm proposing to approach this. I normally say at this time, does that sound like a reasonable game plan? Do my speed and volume seem appropriate? I haven't the faintest idea. I'm just going to keep going. And if people feel otherwise, hopefully they'll let us know. So first, we're going to talk about some general concepts about mostly the open meetings law, not only the open meetings law, but mostly the open meetings law. Then we may talk about what constitutes a quorum considerations, and recusal. We probably will talk about recusal. We may not spend a lot of time on quorum. We're going to talk about informal gatherings with a quorum of a board present. I'm confident we're going to talk about that. I'm also confident we're going to talk about what I call out-of-school gatherings, meaning gatherings that happen not at town hall, village hall, or city hall, but gatherings that happen usually with less than a quorum in much less formal settings outside of the municipal building. I think we should talk about site inspections for 2 reasons. Number one, because I always talk about site inspections, but number 2 in the recent training sessions I've given about open government and planning and zoning decision-making, I have gotten a shocking, to me, number of questions and comments about site inspections. So it's my perception that site inspections is kind of a hot button issue. So unless anybody suggests otherwise, we're definitely going to talk about site inspections. I think we should talk about something that's not a very hot button item because people don't really know about it. It's what we call attorney-client privileged communications. So I would like to talk about that even if people don't think it's a hot button item. And then we may or may not talk about executive session parts of meetings, largely because executive sessions don't really come up too often in planning and zoning meetings, subject to maybe one sort of executive session, which I'll mention, but very briefly. And if you think that all the things I've talked about thus now seem to have, until now, have seemed to focus on the open meetings law, you're absolutely 100% correct. Because while good government principles lend themselves to both open meetings law and freedom of information law, or FOIL, I'm going to make the rash assumption that the majority of you are taking a class called Open Government and Planning and Zoning Decision Making because you're members of a planning board, a zoning board of appeals, or you're somehow connected to a planning board or zoning board of appeals, or maybe you're an elected legislative official of a town, village, or city, but you have a particular interest in planning and zoning. Maybe you're even the liaison of your town board, village board, or city council. So freedom of information law issues come up far less frequently in planning and zoning decision-making than they do in other arenas. When I do presentations to town clerks, for example, freedom of information law issues are huge, enormous, gigantic for town clerks and for records access officers in general, most but not all of whom are town clerks, village clerks, or city clerks. But if we have time and if people have any freedom of information law issues, questions, comments, pet peeves, or the like, we certainly can talk about freedom of information law because in all fairness, it is part of open government decision-making. Not so much decision-making, but it's part of open government. So those are the things that I'd like to talk about. I'm one of the reasons I said that, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to make it, is my own opinion is listening to one person drone on for an hour gets boring. In virtual land, you can alleviate that boredom in many, many ways that I'll never know. But one way you could think about alleviating that boredom is if you have a question or comment that's on topic, feel free to try to jump in. And again, because we work the controls, we may or may not let you jump in, but you can at least make the effort. And if we need to, we'll save it for the end and talk about it in a less formal context at the end of the hour. So here are my introductory comments. And my experience, the things that I try to set the table with in the abstract, everyone agrees. Nobody disagrees. It's, mom, the flag, apple pie stuff. In the abstract and the hypothetical, everybody agrees. I say them anyway because I hold them near and dear to my professional brain and my personal heart. And in the abstract hypothetical, I've yet to find people disagree with it. However, when the rubber meets the road and we go into real life situations and try to apply both legal principles and especially practical reality constraints, all of a sudden, some of these things are not as popular. So what are some of the introductory concepts that I'm a proponent of and believe in, and I think pretty much everybody does, at least in the abstract? Open government is generally considered good government, right? The sort of the key word these days is transparency. I don't use that particular word that often. I just talk about open government, but transparency in this context means open government. I think everyone agrees in concept, open government is good government. So I throw out this fundamental premise relating to planning and zoning decision-making. And this is kind of my mantra that colors my advice about everything I say about planning and zoning decision-making, at least in the context of the open government issues. And that mantra is, and it's I made this up, no specific law, rule, or regulation says this. But my mantra is that the fundamental premise is that all decision-making should occur at open public meetings. So all the players get to see and hear the entire process. Now we can stop right there and you all can go about your business with the rest of your evening and do whatever you want and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good, strong, fundamental premise. He didn't really tell us anything we didn't already know. I'm not really getting my money's worth, so to speak. But that's the fundamental premise that I think colors all advice and guidance. And I'm going to talk about advice and guidance in a minute. Actually, right now I will. One super important thing I have to stress to you all is that there's a distinction between legal requirements, sometimes a distinction between legal requirements, technical legal requirements, and practical realities and practices. So that there are some things that are good practices that go above and beyond legal requirements, or they're separate from legal requirements. There are some things that are bad practices that clearly are contrary to legal requirements. But it's really important that I make this distinction because occasionally I'll give a presentation or a training session and I'll try to emphasize that something I'm saying is not a legal requirement, but it's what I call a higher goal. And I'm a big believer in shooting for the higher goals. And sometimes I don't make that as clear as I need to. And I've actually heard people say at subsequent gatherings, hey, Mark Schachtner said we must do blah, blah, blah. When Mark Schachtner really did not say you, or did not mean to say you must do blah, blah, blah. What I'm trying to say is this is a great practice that goes above and beyond minimum legal requirements. So if you feel I'm not making that distinction clear and that I'm saying something that you can't tell whether it's required or just an aspirational goal, please interrupt and make me clarify that. That's really, really important. So I already said the open meetings law is the most relevant law in open government and planning and zoning decision-making. And for the next bunch of time, I'm going to focus on open meetings law issues. It's an open government law, clearly. I'm assuming that the vast majority of attendees are not attorneys, and my colleagues and I are not so fond of legalese anyway, so I'm going to try to avoid legalese and really not lapse into it much at all. The open meetings law generally mandates that all meetings of public bodies be open to the public, right? Hence the name. It also includes exceptions or exemptions when meetings need not be open to the public, and we'll probably talk about a couple of those. Critical. The statute is clearly intended to promote rather than discourage transparency, and it's supposed to promote the sharing of governmental access and information. So one principle that people often don't appreciate is even if an exemption or exception from the open meetings law is triggered, meaning it might apply, that doesn't mean that a board must conduct whatever the business that triggers the exemption is behind closed doors. Almost invariably, it just means a board may lawfully use that opportunity to deny public access, but it's not required to. So I hear people say, hey, the following topic doesn't have to be discussed at an open public meeting and therefore can't be. That is not true. With very few exceptions, mostly involving invasions of personal privacy that no planning or board or zoning board would contemplate discussing at an open public meeting anyway, with very, very few exceptions, any business to be discussed by a planning board or zoning board of appeals, even if it technically might trigger an exemption, can be discussed at an open public meeting, and I would suggest should be discussed at an open public meeting. So what do we mean by open public meeting of a board? Okay, this brings in the quorum principle, Q-U-O-R-U-M, quorum. What constitutes a quorum? In order to lawfully constitute a quorum, a board has to have the attendance of a sufficient number of members that constitute a majority of the entire membership. Important words in that principle are majority, which is not hard to understand, but it's of the entire membership of the board. Not if, for example, there's a vacant seat on a 5-member board, it's still a 5-member board, okay? If there are 2 vacant seats on a 5-member board, it's still a 5-member board. You would need 3 members of a 5-member board to constitute a quorum. No matter how many are around, no matter how many physically are available for a particular meeting, and even if some of the seats are vacant, not just that evening, but they haven't been filled anyway. It's either a 5-member board or it's a 7-member board, and a quorum means a majority of the entire membership of the board. Now, pre-pandemic, meeting participation required the board members' physical presence. Early pandemic, meeting participation essentially prohibited the board members' physical presence, and now many boards are doing hybrids, some remote and some physical attendance. But pre-COVID, meeting participation required physical presence. I don't know what's going to happen after the pandemic. Many of us think that it's been very healthy, despite the pandemic, that it's been very healthy to allow virtual participation. The last time I asked, and I have to confess it's been several weeks, I had not heard anything about any legislature thoughts about extending the ability to participate in public meetings virtually. I personally hope and professionally hope it does happen. If any of you on the Zoom know otherwise and know that there is a movement in that direction, please inform us because I'd love to learn that. So I'm not,
Mark,
yeah.
we have a question. How do you handle alternate members? Do you count the alternates as a full board member when determining a quorum?
There are lots of mysteries about alternate members. And by the way, I'm a huge proponent of having alternate members, but the mysteries don't include that question. That's a pretty straightforward answer. It's the membership of the board. A 5-member board with 2 alternates is still a 5-member board. A 7-member board with 2 alternates is still a 7-member board. So the difficulties, and this is not an open government issue, so we're probably not going to talk about this evening. I've actually do a training session specifically about use of alternate members. And I think I maybe wrote an article about that in the New York Planning and Zoning Forum also. There are a lot of tricky aspects to use of Planning Board and Zoning Board of Appeals alternate members. But as far as the quorum and the open public meeting aspect goes, they're considered a full member if and when they're seated as such. They're considered just alternate members when they're not, but they don't affect the count. They don't affect the count of what's a quorum. They don't affect the count of the number of votes required. And you should never use an alternate member to exceed, you should never have an 8-person vote on a 7-member board or a 6-person vote on a 5-member board. That's actually pretty important. Okay, so we know what a quorum is. What we don't, so let's talk about what if a quorum dissolves? And that happens sometimes. In order for the meeting to be a valid, lawful, open public meeting, the quorum has to be maintained throughout the meeting. If a board member leaves a meeting, the remaining members have to constitute a quorum. That obviously could happen. Or if too many leave, then the meeting's essentially over. It might be over just for a few minutes if the members have just left for a few minutes, or it's literally over because it's not a quote unquote public meeting, meaning it's not an official meeting if less than a quorum of the board members are present. So the obvious question is when the quorum dissolves, even though there's no more official public meeting, can the remaining members, which are now less than a quorum, lawfully stay and discuss whatever they were discussing without violating the open meetings law? Well, to some people's surprise, the answer is yes. They wouldn't be violating the open meetings law because the open meetings law applies to actual public meetings when a quorum is present. But it's not a good practice at all. The remaining members should, in my opinion, and this is one of those differences between what's legal and what's practical and best practice, they should not stick around and keep talking about the applications and the like because their fellow members are not available. It's no longer an official public meeting of the town, city, or village of blah, 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 Planning Board or Zoning Board of Appeals. So I would highly discourage after the conclusion of the official public meeting discussion, just as I would highly discourage board members from sitting around and shooting the breeze after applications after a meeting's closed, but before they leave the room. So even a temporary absence has to reduce the meeting to no longer an official public meeting, but of course that can be resumed as soon as the member comes back. Now, people then say, well, what about a recusal situation? What if one or more board members recuse? The answer is the same as any other type of departure. If you're recusing, and there are many instances where it's very appropriate and very responsible for a board member to recuse themselves from participating in that matter. And we'll talk about that a little bit later if people want. That used to be a hotter button item than it used to be. And I used to spend a lot of time talking about the mechanics of recusal and when it might be required. We'll probably not do that, at least not in the main part of our discussion here. But a recused member is just like an alternate member that's not seated yet or whatever. They don't count in the count for the vote. They don't count in the count for having the meeting. And again, recusal can be extremely appropriate. And I urge people to do so when it is appropriate. So let's shift gears to talk about informal gatherings when a quorum is present. Okay, and this, I used to think, oh, this never happens. Apparently that's not the case. We'll backtrack a little bit to some of the definitions under the open meetings law. But, open meetings law requires that the meeting convened by a board for the purpose of conducting official business be properly noticed and open to the public. You hopefully noticed that I just emphasized the words for the purpose of conducting official business or public business. So it's not intended to apply, well, let me back up a step. It's not limited to meetings held at the public buildings. It's not limited to meetings held at the official meeting place. So board members cannot lawfully circumvent the law just by gathering somewhere else. And board members cannot lawfully circumvent the law by gathering in a less formal setting. So I guess this used to, I shouldn't say I guess, I know this used to happen a lot. Where this used to happen a real lot, and it was very upsetting to me and very offensive to me, when I first started doing what I do, which is largely working with municipalities. I used to work for a lot of private entities, so I appeared before planning boards and zoning board of appeals instead of sitting up with the boards as I do now. And I remember several municipalities in particular, I'd be there pitching whatever I was pitching, and the board members kind of acted like they'd already discussed it and already decided it. And they had already discussed it and already decided. And where had they done that? In the break room, in town hall, or in the kitchen room, in the meal room, what have you. I think that used to happen a lot. I think it doesn't, and they used to do it en masse. The entire board would come up for the pre-meeting meeting. They'd go to the break room. They literally, there was no big secret about this. They would go through the agenda and talk about each item and then come into the room and the public meeting would begin. And of course, they seemed like they'd already discussed and decided the applications because they'd pretty much already had discussed and decided the applications. In my experience, at least, that practice really doesn't happen much anymore at all, if ever. So what I call the around the kitchen table discussion by board members to avoid the open meetings law, at least in my experience, does not really happen anymore. Now, we get questions about this surprisingly frequently. Well, if the open meetings law requires that anytime a quorum of the members of the public body are gathering, that's an open public meeting. Remember my words, that's not exactly what the open meetings law says. So there's no open meetings law violation if most of the members or even all of the members of a board attend the same social function or happen to be at the same place at the same time. And as I said, we get a surprising number of questions. I saw 3 members of the 5-member planning board out having dinner together. Isn't that an illegal official meeting? It's an illegal official meeting if they're out having dinner together and they're conducting the business of the planning board. But you don't get paid millions of dollars to be a member of a planning board or a zoning board of appeals in the vast majority of municipalities in the state of New York. You're allowed to socialize with whomever you socialize with. Obviously, if you socialize only with members of your land use board, it's going to be hard to not stray from the rules and to avoid talking about the applications that are pending before your board. But with the calls we get I saw the same people, from the board at the library meeting. I saw them at, athletic event. I saw them at a play. They're members of the same book club. Fine. They're allowed to do all those things as long as, are they on the honor system? Yes. Are they honorable? In my experience, they're usually honorable. So there's no violation of open meetings law when board members of the same public body happen to be in the same place at the same time, at the same social function, or at whatever. Similarly, but not the same principle, the quorum of one board attending the meeting of another board does not make that an illegal gathering of the first board, the ones that are the attendees. Now, it's an open public meeting anyway, by definition, in my hypothetical, so it doesn't really matter. But, members of the planning board can go to town board meetings. Of course they can go. That doesn't make it a planning board meeting. So I think that principle is reasonably obvious. And by the way, one time or one place that people that are more than the quorum of many, many boards gather is training sessions. So right this minute, we likely have a quorum or more than a quorum of a number of land use boards. We're not physically in the same place at the same time, but we're doing the same thing. But training sessions, for any number of reasons, are not considered subject to the open meetings law as open meetings. Many are, but they're not considered subject to that. Somebody want to jump in, Jean?
Yeah, I think there's a question related to this, and it's from Michael. He asks, how can your town village mitigate liability in such cases? I'm assuming it is related to meeting in
Illegal meeting.
Illegal meetings.
All right, let's run with that assumption since that's what we're talking about. So I'm going to answer the question in 2 parts. When we use the word liability, typically we mean economic liability, and very, very few planning board, I'll just say land use board decisions. We also have design review commissions and architectural reviews and the like. Very few land use board decisions run any risk of financial liability to the municipality. Very, very few. Not zero, but very, very few. Now, the other type of liability that's meaningful to me in my day job is, what about Article 78 challenges to the decision, and can they be challenged successfully? Yeah, the answer to that's absolutely. So there's not much risk of financial liability to having illegal meetings. Not no risk, but very little risk. But there's plenty of risk of having successful Article 78 challenges, and Article 78 proceeding being a challenge to a planning board, ZBA, or land use board decision. There's plenty of risk to having successful challenge to a land use board decision if the land use board is conducting illegal meetings. Plenty of risk. And the answer of what can you do to avoid it is simple: don't conduct illegal meetings.
And before you go on,
Yep.
there's probably 3 or 4 questions about recusals. Did you want to go? I know you're talking about something. You've gone on to something different. You want to wait until the end on that, or do you want to talk about that now?
Let's talk about it now, because like I said before, it used to be a really big deal. And if we have several questions about it, I mean, I'm not sure, are the questions focused on how do we keep our meeting going, or are they more about when to recuse, how to recuse? Can we get a flavor for them?
What if you have 5-member board and 3 recusals, and the alternate posts are vacant?
All right, so we got a problem.
Yeah, problem.
This is there's a couple of ways to approach that situation. One is examine the recusals. Has anybody recused maybe when they didn't really need to? Another is, I can't remember if the person is saying that, I think the person is saying there are alternate members' seats, but nobody's been appointed, I think is what they're saying. Let's recruit. That's another way. Then this is a very esoteric thing I'm about to mention. I know for sure our counsel for the Association of Towns, who's on board, knows about this, and if she wants to weigh in, I would welcome her in doing that, but I'm not forcing her. There's something called, there's a little known legal principle. I'm not a big legalese guy, but there's a little known legal principle called the Doctrine of Necessity. And the way the Doctrine of Necessity might apply in that sort of situation is we might have to allow one or more of the recused members to participate. They would have to explain their basis for recusal, why they feel they can't be objective or whatever, but still have them participate in order to solve the problem. Because what is not an acceptable solution to that problem is let the remaining 2 members vote, carry the day. So that's a real, very insightful question. Fortunately, it doesn't come up too often. But again, it fits right into me being such a big proponent of having alternate members. Part of my survey used to be, we have somebody saying we're on target. Part of my survey used to be, and how many municipalities in their land use boards have alternate members? And, when I first started doing this presentation or similar presentations 30 years ago, well, 30 years ago was before the authorization. But after the authorization's been in place now for the better part of 20 years, if I recall the date right. And at the beginning, it was slow to gather steam, and very few hands would go up when I'd say how many have alternate members, but it's clearly evolving in the right direction. And now many, many, many hands go up, way more than half. So, by all means, get alternate members.
And I guess another question is, when somebody recuses themselves, do they have to give a reason for the recusal?
The answer is they do not have to give a reason. They can, and then I'll spend 1 more minute I'll spend 2 more minutes on recusal to say 2 things that are really important. One is hugely misunderstood. The recusal decision is made solely, the binding recusal decision is made solely by the individual themselves. In other words, the board can't tell the person you must recuse. The chairperson can't tell the person you must recuse. The person can seek advice from anybody they want, including the chairperson, the board, myself, people like me, the Association of Towns, the New York Planning. You can seek advice from anybody you want, but the decision is the individuals alone. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. I have been at board meetings where the board has taken a vote and said, motion made to say Ms. Jones cannot participate in this. The motion's been seconded, the motion's been voted on. The motion is of no legal binding force and effect. The law is that other than the people in the black robes, by which I mean the judges, only the individual themselves has the recusal decision. The other thing that's really misunderstood about recusal is the mechanics of it. What do I do? A difference between legal requirement and best practice. legal requirement is just state that you're recusing. As we just said, you don't have to state the reason, but you can. And then don't participate in the board's discussion of that item or that matter. But some people think you are required to physically distance yourself, and that is not true. However, this is one of my pet peeves. I think it looks really bad when a member recuses themselves and stays physically up with the board. It's especially hard for them to hide their body language or to not, nod and to not, make, whisper things or whatever. So not legally required, but by far the best practice is to physically step down. Best thing in the world, get out of the room. Next best thing, step down, stay in the room, but don't stay up where you're, with your fellow board members. But I have to stress that is not legally required. Now we'll talk about the least popular, I think this is the least popular thing I talk about. And then we'll talk about site inspections, because I'm pretty sure people will want to hear something about site inspections. So why do I say this is the least popular thing I talk about? The least popular thing in this, at least in this context, that I talk about is these, what I call out of school non-meetings, less than a quorum, but for whatever reason, whether it's somebody calling somebody on the phone, engaging in the vice of emails, or running into somebody at the grocery store or whatever. Out of school meetings include all these things. And no matter what kind of out of school meeting you're happening, less than a quorum, it's not illegal, because there's, by definition, less than a quorum involved, by definition of what I'm talking about. I made the definition. What I'm saying, out of school non-meetings of less than a quorum. So with that label, it's clearly not violating the open meetings law, because it doesn't involve a quorum of the members. But these informal out of school meetings, whether they're one-on-one or larger, in my opinion, should be highly discouraged. Why? Because they violate what I stated at the beginning as the fundamental premise, which was all decision-making should be done at open public meetings. And I don't just mean the actual motion, that's the decision. I mean all aspects of the decision-making. And I said all players should get to see and hear the entire process. Well, if the planning board chairperson is meeting on a regular basis with the applicant and giving the applicant feedback on the application and helping the applicant formulate the application and do things like that, that's part of the process that's happening, and it's happening outside of open public meetings. So while that is not illegal, I think it should be highly, highly discouraged. I think it's inappropriate. Now, that example is, an intentional out of school meeting. There's a lot of unintentional out of school meetings. As I mentioned earlier, you run into somebody in the grocery store, in the library. They call you, they send you an email, whatever. I used to be so adamant about this that I was somewhat misunderstood. And I saw somebody who said, hey, I took your advice. I hung up on the person that called me, and they were 100% serious. I said, please, I'm not saying stop being a friendly person. I'm not saying stop being hospitable. I'm saying when the person calls you, say, Mr. Jones, I'm sorry, but I'm really not supposed to discuss the planning board matters, separately outside of the open public meetings. When you run into people in the grocery store, this happens to me actually a lot. I live in a sort of small town, and people say to me, how could the planning board possibly decide blah, blah, blah? Or how could you decide blah, blah, blah? Well, for starters, one really good thing, one saving grace is I don't decide anything. I'm not a member. But when members get those questions, or, please deny the blah, blah, blah application, and let's talk about it. Well, let's not talk about it. Let's say in as friendly and polite a manner as we can, Mr. Smith, Ms. Jones, you obviously have strong opinions about this. That's wonderful. Please bring them to the board. Best way to bring them to the board is come to our meeting. Harder, easier said than done, especially right now. But even without pandemic considerations, if you can't come to the meeting, send in a comment, address it to the board, but don't send it to me at my house. Don't email it to me personally. Send it to the board. I used to say, if your discouragement of these informal discussions fails, and then I decided I should stop saying if your discussion prevention efforts fail, and I should change if to when. So when those efforts are unsuccessful, what do? You don't be rude. You don't be dismissive. You try your best to say, we're not supposed to talk about it. When that effort fails, you then listen to whatever part you have to listen to. And at the next board meeting, if that person doesn't show up and express their view again, you say to the board, look, board, I want you to know, Mr. Jones, I ran into Mr. Jones at the grocery store, and he talked to me for a while. And among other things, he really emphasized with me and harped on it for a bit that there's an endangered species present on the site that the applicant hasn't disclosed. And you say to the board, this is what Mr. Jones told me, and I haven't the faintest idea if it's true, but we should, that's his comment, and he was told it to me. We should discuss that because it's a potential issue. That way you're taking it out of the realm of secrecy and you're making it, the watchword is transparent. I think that in real life, one of the things that I used to really get upset about is the example I gave, which is when planning board chair people met on a regular basis with applicants and helped them formulate the application. I have seen it backfire quite spectacularly. I haven't seen that happen frequently, but when it has backfired, the backfiring has been quite spectacular and has left really bad tastes in people's mouths. So I still think that all these informal discussions are a bad practice and should be avoided as much as possible. Remember, I'm talking about board members, not our very helpful, capable staff members. Municipal planner, municipal zoning officer, municipal, whatever role they have, a town engineer, village engineer, whatever. There's no open meetings law considerations legally when they're having dialogues with applicants and their consultants, and that can really help the process along. Again, the results of those discussions should certainly be discussed at open public meetings, but the watchwords I'm throwing out there are for board members because you're the decision makers. So that's all I want to say, I think, about what I call the out-of-school meetings. And unless we get a question in capital letters with a bunch of exclamation points, I'm going to switch over to site inspections. Site inspections clearly raise some open meetings law issues. And site inspections used to be really misunderstood. The open meetings law aspects of site inspections is what I mean. And I guess they're still somewhat misunderstood. I'm a little bit surprised. So here are things that people will tell you about site inspections. Some people, the same person will not tell you all these things about site inspections. Some people will tell you, or somebody used to be at least, illegal. It is illegal for the board to visit the site. Trespass consideration, whatever, it's illegal. Some people say, well, board members can visit sites, but they can only do so individually, meaning one at a time. Some people will say, well, multiple board members can visit sites, but never a quorum. So 2 can go, 3 can go if it's a 7-member board, not if it's a 5-member board, but never a quorum. Some people say, or used to say, any number can go, they can go together. It doesn't matter if it constitutes a quorum or not. And then I guess the last 2 extremes were, there are places where they say site inspections are mandatory. The board members must conduct site inspections and must go to the properties and visit the properties. And then lastly, the ratcheting this up, I've gone from least formal to most formal, ratcheting this up. There are some that say, hey, wait a minute, site inspection, if a quorum is present, it must be an open public meeting. It must be properly noticed. The public must have access to it. There have to be minutes kept. There has to be minutes kept and the like, full-blown open public meeting. Okay, so what do those things have in common? I said already that clearly no one person said all those things. What those things have in common is that they're essentially incorrect. So what is correct? And by the way, I'm a huge fan of site inspections. I'm one of these people that you can write out for me what the site distance issue is, or the berm visibility, or the wetlands issue is. Writing it out does nothing for me. Seeing it live does a lot for me, keeping in mind that nobody really cares what I think anyway, because I'm just a legal guider, not the decision maker. But having said that, I'm a big fan, proponent of site inspections. And what I've told you, some of the things that are not correct, what is correct? Okay, site inspections are clearly permissible. So nobody can rightly say to you they're illegal. Are there constraints and factors that have to go into conducting site inspections? Yes, there certainly are. They can be done individually. They can be done multiple members. Doing them multiple members does not make it an open public meeting. I do know municipalities that treat it that way. I think that's fraught with peril for a number of reasons. I do not think it's illegal, by the way. I don't think it's illegal to treat it as an open public meeting. This is, again, one of those distinctions between legal requirement and best practice and or practical reality. But I think it's fraught with peril. It's fraught with peril. And again, I'm talking about is making it an official open public meeting. It's fraught with peril because that means John and Jane Q. Public must have access to the meeting. Well, if John and Jane Q. Public are infirm, disabled, or whatever, then providing them access may be difficult or will be difficult. Getting private people on private property raises a whole slew of problems in terms of, if you live where I live and you're doing that site inspection in the month of February, somebody's going to slip on the property, guaranteed. What about minutes? Are we now dragging the poor hapless? And I say that with nothing but respect, because in my opinion, zoning enforcement officers and planning and zoning secretary clerks have some of the most thankless jobs there are. So I'm saying that with nothing but respect, but do our poor hapless planning and zoning clerks have to attend the site inspections and take minutes of these things like it's a meeting? There's a lot of problems with that. Now, critical thing about site inspections, from my perspective, by far the most important thing about site inspections, in order to stay away from, really, they should be considered open public meetings, you should not be conducting business at the site inspection. What do I mean by that? You should not be discussing the merits of the applications and deliberating and engaging in your, should we approve, should we deny, what conditions should we impose. That sort of deliberation should not be occurring at your site inspections. Now, again, it's a slippery slope. What I tell people, and I'm not making this, I didn't make this up. What others like me tell people is, go to the site inspection, be a sponge, take in information, don't disseminate information, not to your fellow planning board members, and certainly not to the applicant or anybody else who is present. By the way, what's the most remarkable coincidence of any site inspection? The most remarkable coincidence of any site inspection is, no matter how announced it is or not announced it is, no matter if you do it in the stealth of night or when you do it, no matter what the weather, who's always happens to be there is the property owner, the applicant, or somebody like the property owner applicant. When that happens, you certainly can't say to the applicant property owner, leave, we're doing our site inspection. You could ask politely and they might respect that and do so, but that's not real life. What's going to happen in real life? I say you're a sponge. I say you're there to take in information. People used to misinterpret me, some people, and say I imposed a gag order on you when you're at site inspection and you can't say anything. Well, that's clearly not right, and that's clearly impractical. So I just finished saying, don't discuss the application, and then I followed up with saying, but don't feel like you have a gag order and you can't say anything, but you're a sponge. So what am I talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. When you go to the site, you want to know, you want to see where the proposed berm is going to be located. And if you're like me, you need the map, and you hold up the map, and you may have trouble figuring it out. Well, the applicant is always happy to help you. The applicant, how often will the following exchange happen? Where the applicant says, here's the location of the proposed berm. And that's all the applicant says. That will happen never. What happens is the applicant says, here's where we're going to put the berm, and this will be the finest, most beautiful, best functioning berm ever constructed in the continental United States, because that's human nature, and that's what the applicant's going to do. When that happens, you should not engage in debate and say, gee, I don't think that's a good place for it. You should put it here, or what have you. You should not express your opinion. You're a sponge taking in information. But it is perfectly appropriate to say, okay, which intersection are we talking about? Where's the location of the wetlands? Show me the view or the protected tree grove that we're considering. It's okay to ask those questions so the site inspection has the most meaning. Again, I think site inspections are terrific, and that's sort of the guidance for them. Are there questions or comments, Jean?
Yeah, there's a couple related to permission to go on the property. If I do a site inspection, am I trespassing if I have not asked permission? And the second question was, site inspection, do we need permission to step on the property?
Right. So the short answers are, absent permission, you technically would be trespassing if you go on the private property. And therefore, the answer to question 2 is you should gain and seek permission. You should seek and gain permission. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is many municipalities recognizing that, because you don't have a right just by being on a board, you don't have a right to go on people's private property. So a couple of things, and these are all in my opinion, in the category of practical reality, not just legal requirements. Many municipalities now have, as part of the application itself, a waiver, a consent/waiver. So by making this application, I'm also consenting to and waiving any problem with the board conducting site inspection at my property. And that's perfectly appropriate, totally appropriate. Then let's also talk about the practical realities of this. If I'm an applicant and I want to get a variance from my town, village, or city zoning board of appeals, or I want a site plan approval or a conditional use approval or whatever the heck I want, or a special use permit from my municipality, how likely is it that I'm going to dig my heels in and say, I refuse to allow you on my property? That's not likely to promote and encourage the likelihood of me getting my approval. So in real life, as a practical matter, it can be as simple as just saying, hey, applicant, I'd like to visit your property. Is that okay? Yes. If you don't ask and you go visit the property, how often has that been a problem? Almost never. I say almost because it's not true that it's never been a problem, because we have feisty people who from time to time operate, in my opinion, not in their own best interest and take issue with things like site inspections. But again, think about it. In real life, how likely is the applicant to fight you on a site inspection when they want your approval? So now I'd like to talk about the topic that I threatened to talk about that's not very well known, but it's very much an open meetings law topic. And then I'll just say a couple of words about executive sessions. And then I think we'll be nearing the end of our initial hour, and then open it up to be of a more back and forth dialogue with questions and comments. The not so well known, or maybe I would say extremely not well known topic that I want to talk about is what's called attorney-client privileged communications. Attorney-client privileged communications. So it sort of is what it sounds like. It's communications between me and people like me, between attorneys and their clients, which are privileged, and privilege means, in our context now, not subject to the open meetings law and not subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information law. So this is not an executive session of an otherwise lawful open public meeting. Attorney-client privilege conferences are a different creature. They're a different animal. And the reason I'm going to talk about them is because as planning and zoning gets more complex, which I submit it has, I guess selfishly from the standpoint of my continuing to be employed, that's a good thing. But honestly, I think lawyers make a lot of things more complicated than they need to be. And I think legislators make a lot of things more complicated than they need to be. In a totally different presentation on a different topic, I read verbatim as fast as I possibly can a 107-word sentence from a statute. And I say then, and I say now, there's no such thing as an understandable 107-word sentence. Not in this context, not in any context. So it's really hard to explain what an attorney-client privilege conference is different, or how it's different than an executive session. But the bottom line is that if a board has legal questions that it wants to confer with its counsel about, you have the right to do that anytime, any place, not subject to the open meetings law, not subject to public notice requirements, no minutes, no nothing. I am not saying this to encourage you to increase, likely from zero, but to either start having attorney-client privilege communication meetings with your attorneys behind closed doors, or to increase the number of times you do so. But I am saying this to make sure you're aware of the opportunity should the legitimate need arise. And in my personal professional experience, the need is arising more because planning and zoning laws are becoming more complicated. So boards are having more trouble understanding some of the legal issues that are associated with their decision-making responsibilities. So while no board that I work with, and I work for a couple of dozen municipalities, no board that I work with has more than a couple of attorney-client privilege conference meetings with me in a given year. But many boards that never had any will now sometimes say, I don't understand the legal issues that we're dealing with in this particular application. Can I confer with you about them? And they don't have to do it as a group, but the point is that they can do it as a group. And by the way, this is misunderstood enough so that if/when you do this, my prediction is you may be criticized for having an unlawful illegal meeting. I can promise you, you will not be guilty of that criticism, but I can also say you might be criticized for that. Some of the other people on this Zoom know that it is perfectly lawful to have such conferences. I literally carry with me copies of opinions, legal opinions, stating that it's legal. Every now and then, as recently as 2 years ago, a newspaper reporter got extraordinarily upset with me because he felt that this had been an illegal meeting, and I tried to explain the subtlety and the nuance. I failed, as I sometimes do. I encouraged that person to contact the Committee on Open Government. The Committee on Open Government explained it to him, and he ended up apologizing for making a big ruckus at our meeting and accusing us of conducting illegal meetings. So that is, I am not explaining any of that with the intent of telling you, start having more attorney-client privilege conferences with your counsel. I am telling it to you so that you know that if the legitimate need arises, you have that opportunity. And while you may or may not be criticized for it, it is not illegal, it's perfectly legal, perfectly lawful, perfectly appropriate. I said I would talk about executive sessions. An executive session, in contrast, and I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes here, in contrast to what I just discussed, an executive session is a different creature that is a separate part of an otherwise lawfully convened open public meeting. There's lots of complexities to the exemptions from the open meetings law that allow for executive session. Executive session meaning the board is meeting behind closed doors, essentially. But so few are relevant to planning and zoning decision-making that I'm only going to mention the only one that is typically relevant to planning and zoning decision-making, and that is if you are challenged I said it's an Article 78 proceeding. If you've not heard that term before, don't be intimidated by it. It's just a type of legal challenge to, among other things, land use boards. If you are challenged by way of an Article 78 proceeding and you want to discuss the case with your attorney, or your attorney wants to discuss it with you, or even if you don't want to discuss it with your attorney, you just want to discuss it among yourselves, you're allowed to discuss a litigation case behind closed doors. Does that make sense? I think it does, because for one thing, especially if you're discussing it with your attorney, you want to hear about the strategy for defending the Article 78 case, and you and your attorney should not be forced to, in the name of transparency, to share your defense strategy with your adversaries who are members of the public, perhaps. So, but the executive session creature is really only relevant to land use boards in the context of when there's been a litigation Article 78 challenge. And by the way, don't play fast and loose with that and say, well, there's going to be an Article 78 challenge. You may have legal questions because you're foreseeing an Article 78 legal challenge. And if you have legal questions, and again, this may seem like a distinction without significance, but legally it's of great significance, you can meet with your legal counsel, as I discussed, in an attorney-client privilege setting, but you cannot say, hey, I think we're going to be sued. Let's go into executive session to discuss the litigation. There ain't no litigation yet just because you think you're going to be sued. So as a practical matter, very seldom would a land use board have a lawful ground for going into executive session, other than if it's to discuss an existing litigation case. Similarly, similar in the sense of it's not super applicable, the Freedom of Information Law is a separate creature. It's a separate statute from the Open Meetings Law. The gist of it is that all documents relating to your official business can be disclosed if somebody wants to see them, copy them, read them, or whatever, because as the name indicates, the idea is to be transparent and freedom of information. It's readily accessible information. There's a whole process by which people ask for the information. The process has become incredibly cumbersome because of the horrors of email, in my opinion. That's not an official opinion, that's just my opinion. But again, in the context of planning board and ZBA decision-making, or planning and land use decision-making, the Freedom of Information Law is not enormously relevant. Just remember that there's at least a possibility that documents you generate as a planning board or ZBA member could be subject to disclosure to the public if the public wants to see them. If you're like most planning board and ZBA members, you don't generate many documents. And by the way, not all of them are subject to disclosure anyway. So it's not super relevant, but that's traditionally what people want. What people want to know is that there is a second law that's relevant to open government, including planning and zoning decision-making, and that's the Freedom of Information Law. Notice I said you don't generate many documents. You generate some documents, meeting minutes and decision documents, all of which are clearly subject to disclosure and are public documents, the most public they could possibly be. The other thing that you need to know is that any written material submitted as any part of the application review process, subject to very narrow exceptions, are subject to disclosure through the Freedom of Information Law, meaning anybody in the public who wants to see the documents that are at all involved in that application, those are documents that have to be made accessible to the public. The rare exception is if for some reason somebody's got something that's legitimately a trade secret that's in their application documents, that'd be the sort of thing that could be protected. But typically the way that'd be protected would be just literally redacting, the specific narrow information, but the entire rest of the application would still be public information. There's no real reason that anybody has to include that sort of sensitive information in a planning board or ZBA application, but once in a while it might sneak in. So we're wrapping up our hour. I have normally I have a sense of, whether people have been around and stuck around and are gaining some knowledge or not. I have no sense of that in virtual land, it's hard to say. But if people have questions and comments, I'm happy to stick around for 10 or 15 minutes and deal with things. And Jean, I'll leave it up to you, but I'm fine with unmuting people and letting them just ask them on their own behalf if you want. Whatever works for you is fine with me.
Okay, we have a couple questions that we did not get to that I think are pertinent, and I think you can answer. This one is from Judy. If a specialized subcommittee of a board meets where no decision is made, but the committee flushes out various ideas or projects that may be eventually presented to the board, can other board members attend that meeting to obtain general information or to speak to one of the agenda items?
All right, so the answer, and again, one of the downsides of virtual is a lot of times in live, I get the audience to participate by throwing out what they think are the answers to the questions. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that here. So the answer is, it sounds like, this would somewhat depend on exactly the nature of the committee, but if the committee is really just an ad hoc committee that has no binding authority of any kind, and it's not one of the special committees that are creatures of law, which there are some, then it's possible that this wasn't even the question that was asked, but it's possible that its meetings might not even be subject to the open meetings law. But the best practice is clearly to make committee meetings open to the public. The question was more narrow, which was, can board members attend the committee meeting and listen to the committee discussion and even comment? And the answer, without violating the open meetings law, the answer is clearly yes. Clearly yes. By the way, many committees include members of land use boards if they're about planning and zoning. The most obvious example being comprehensive land use, comprehensive plan committees. There's also a legal mechanism whereby a comprehensive plan committee could even be the entire land use board. And of course, those meetings are public meetings and open to the public, and it's official business. But yeah, members can go to their sibling board meetings. A planning board member can go to the ZBA meetings. I don't like if they actively participate there. I think that's inappropriate. It's not illegal. I just think it's inappropriate for a number of reasons, which I can elaborate on if people care, but I won't unless anybody asks. But yes, certainly the answer to the question is affirmative. Of course, the member can go to those meetings and can even participate. They should not participate by speaking about applications that are pending before their board, because then you've crossed the line, in my opinion, and you're now starting to conduct official business in a manner that others don't know about. But yeah, sure they can.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to do one more question, then I think I'm going to ask people to raise their hand and see how many people we can have ask personally. How are emails and pre-public meeting sharing of information between members regarded, specifically pertaining to pending matters, to inform the planning board members such that the members aren't seeing this information for the first time during the official meeting?
All right, so this is one of the horrors of email. If it hasn't been made readily apparent, I'm a dinosaur, kind of looking the part, I suppose. And I know email has its purpose and its use and all the rest of that, but one of the horrors of emails is now, especially if it's a controversial project, where you may still have late night meetings where everyone gets up and takes their 2 or 3 minute turn at the microphone to say bad things about the controversial project. You're now inundated with literally hundreds of emails. So the answer is each and every one of those emails is part of the public record. Each and every one of them is part of the public record. One really unfortunate misunderstanding is being part of the public record does not mean that someone has to read them aloud at a public meeting. So if somebody tells you you're required legally to read them aloud at a public meeting, that is not true. Please don't stay at your meetings till 2 a.m. reading those 200 emails aloud into the record. Please listen to me. I'm choosing my words carefully, as I tried to do. it is not illegal to have them read aloud at a public meeting. It's just enormously time consuming and not required. But each and every one of those emails is part of the public record, and it's there for, in theory, consideration. And if you're the person I referred to earlier, and I hope people understand I'm doing this with nothing but admiration and respect, but if you're the hapless clerk who, who's the keeper of all these emails, you then have to make sure that the board members get them. It's become easier than it used to be, but they're all part of the public record, all thousands of them.
Great. So at this point, I think I'm going to see if we can't get to a couple people. If someone wants to raise their hand, I will ask you to mute yourself. And let me see. We've got one here, Frank. Frank, can you unmute yourself?
And if so, please tell me where you're from.
Frank, can you hear us? Oh,
Whoever Alice is, the answer is the law is allowed for up to 2 alternate members.
Frank will be joining the one as panelist. Okay, he put his, I don't see Frank anymore. There are a couple other questions at the bottom of the chat that we didn't get to.
All right, and one of the participants just sent a note saying he doesn't think you can unmute, that they can't unmute themselves.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And somebody just asked the question of the biggest horror of all. What about text messages?
Oh.
And that's even more horrific, in my opinion. Here's Frank.
There's Frank.
That's even more horrific, in my opinion, because I don't even know how. I'm so not tech savvy that I don't know how retrievable those are. But and somebody can tell me how retrievable those are. The emails I know are retrievable, but all these communications are part of the formulation of your decision-making process. So in theory, all these communications are subject to being considered public records. It's yet another reason not to text message your fellow board members about, hey, don't you think we should put a condition on this approval allowing, no operation past midnight? Don't do it in a text. Don't do your decision-making via text message, in my opinion.
Frank, would you like to ask your question?
And somebody pointed out how that text messages are easy to delete, and then somebody immediately followed up with, so are emails. And I think, again, I'm not a tech savvy person, but it's really, really, really wreaked havoc. The email thing has wreaked havoc with public commenting. By the way, obviously not limited to planning and zoning decision making, but all sorts of municipal government. And if we can't have people, if people don't have any more written questions, we can just let people go.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions at the end here.
The one I just read stopped mid-sentence, so I couldn't answer it. It was something about board imposing conditions, but I don't know what the question was.
Are personal notes, not minutes, taken by a member during a public planning board meeting subject to FOIL?
So that's a good question. The short answer is it depends. The longer answer is some board members keep notes. In other words, keep notes like for themselves, to help them make their decisions. Very few board members share notes among each other. Emails, yes. Notes, very, very, very seldom. There is an exemption or exception in the Freedom of Information Law for what's called intra-agency communications. And it's likely that if somebody tried to withhold his or her own personal notes, it's likely that they would not be considered subject to disclosure. But again, not requiring disclosure and not allowing disclosure are two very different things. Like the Open Meetings Law, the Freedom of Information Law goal is to promote transparency. So if I were a board member and I was writing notes to myself and somebody demanded to see the notes, I'd probably say, sure, here they are. Here's what I've jotted down to myself.
Okay. Can you see any other questions you'd like to address, Mark?
I'm only seeing the front word, like the parts of the words, and then it doesn't go far enough. Something about digital recordings.
Hmm.
There was also one, if I can interject, Mr. Galloway had asked a couple times, in a 5-person planning board with all 5 present, if 3 recuse himself and an alternate is seated in the room, can the alternate now step in to vote as a quorum?
So I think I understand the question, and the answer would be not only can they, but that's one of the ways you should use an alternate. You don't always know in advance that there's going to be a quorum problem. You don't, or yeah, by the way, the same answer, even if it's not a quorum problem. You know, alternates already they're somewhat thankless as well, depending upon your board and how often you use the alternates. If you're a board of, people that never miss a meeting and never have to recuse, then being an alternate is sort of a thankless position also. But you don't always know in advance that a board member is not going to be available or is going to have to recuse. But if you're lucky enough or, fortunate and wise enough to have alternates, use them any opportunity you can. Anytime there's a vacancy, whether it's just for one matter on a particular evening or it's for that whole meeting or whatever, use the alternate. The answer is a resounding yes. I did see one question I think it's from somebody I know that I work with about workshop meetings and the extent to which I don't remember the question now. The question was either do they have to be open to the public or are they subject to the open meetings law? Sort of 2 versions of the same question. And the answer is absolutely 100% yes. No gray area there whatsoever. The distinction, people use the term workshop meeting sort of fast and loose. My impression is that what they mean by workshop meeting is less formal, no decisions are actually made. Board members just discuss the applications, getting ready for the quote unquote real meeting or the quote unquote official meeting. That's fine, but a workshop meeting is still an official meeting, just so people understand. There's no law there's no law, rule, or regulation that says something called a workshop meeting cannot also include an actual decision. There's no such law, rule, or regulation. The practice, and I think it's a healthy practice, by the way, I think it's a good practice, is if we have workshop meetings, it's a less formal discussion of the application, and then we make our actual decisions at the regular meetings, which are not the workshop meetings. But again, if for some reason a board feels compelled to make a decision at a workshop meeting, it is absolutely allowed to do that. And that's one of the numerous reasons, but not the only reason, that a workshop meeting is an open public meeting subject to the same notice requirements, subject to the same attendance requirements. One common misconception is that open public meeting, I should have said this earlier, actually. I'm glad that question triggered this. One common misconception is that open public meeting means that the public can participate. That is not so. There is no legal right to participate unless something is subject to public hearing. Please do not hear those words to mean the public should not be allowed to participate unless it's a public hearing. What I'm saying is that if a board does not wish to allow public participation, it does not have to do so unless the matter is unless it's a public hearing. As a practical matter, the overwhelming majority of boards allow public participation, even if it's not a public hearing, and that's perfectly fine. But and the reason I said that now is because that's another distinction between regular meeting and workshop meeting. Is many times boards don't allow any public participation at workshop meetings, and they say we're going to limit our discussion to just discussing it with the applicant. But that's fine. They can do that. It's obviously not a public hearing being held, but they cannot say this is just a workshop meeting, so we're not going to let you in. That they cannot do. It's a public meeting subject to the open meetings law, just like a regular meeting.
Okay, I've got one question here. If meetings are digitally recorded, is the recording subject to a FOIL? And maybe I'm going to add, what if they're videotaped, as in Zoom when they're Zoomed?
Right. So now the questioner has done what I feared that somebody would do, which is, and right at the end too, which is open the hornet's nest.
Pandora's box.
Exactly. Open the Pandora's box hornet's nest. That's exactly right. So the short, easy part of this is the Freedom of Information Law pertains to records kept by a municipality in the official course of its business. So if you're a municipality, for example, tape records the meetings like we all used to, right? You know, with the little thing, you know, the little wheels going around. The tapes, by the way, are not the official meeting minutes. The official meeting minutes are still the meeting minutes that are prepared by the clerk/secretary, regardless of how much less detailed they are. Those are still the official meeting minutes, but the tapes are records of sort, because record doesn't just mean written record. So the tapes and recordings and the digital this and the digital that, those are all records, and therefore they're records subject to the Freedom of Information Law, and you have an obligation to disclose them if somebody asks for them. That does not mean you have an obligation to keep them, you know, to do that kind of recording. If you don't do that recording, the record doesn't exist. And one huge important thing to remember about FOIL is FOIL does not require preparation of records that are not otherwise required. So if somebody asks for the record, you know, the list of the blah, 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 and there's no such list, then the answer to that request, a perfectly lawful answer to that request is, that is not a record that we maintain. There is no such list. FOIL does not exist to paralyze town, village, and city clerks by giving people unlimited homework assignments where they say to the clerk, okay, I want you to go develop a list of these things. That's not what it's the purpose of it. The purpose is so that the clerk or records access officer makes available whatever the record is that's already being kept by the municipality. Now, this is somewhat of a slippery slope in this day and age, because now certain types of lists kind of exist in the database anyway, and you just have to tell the database, you know, pick all the people with last name to start with M, and it'll do it like that. So it's a slippery slope. But the answer is, if it's a record that's maintained, even if it's not a physical piece of paper, yes, it's subject to FOIL.
And is there a retention schedule for recordings and video recordings and audio recordings?
That I don't know the exact answer to that. I know there are retention requirements for hard copy records, and if anybody on is one of the clerk people, they probably know the answer to that.
Yeah. Okay.
Ready to wrap up?
We're a little after quarter after. Mark, I want to say thank
Great.
you very much for doing this presentation for us. I see a couple questions in the chat that is asking if this has been recorded and where they can find it. If you registered for this webinar, you will be getting a link to the recording as well as a link to Mark's handout, which is on the Tug Hill Commission's website tomorrow, or as soon as we wrap up here. I'm not sure when Jen usually does that, but I see Jen has put the link to our YouTube page in the chat, so you could go there. There are other training sessions that we have done at the Tug Hill Commission that you could view on our YouTube page that you might find helpful. And I guess with that, Mark, again, thank you very much for doing this session.
My pleasure. Hopefully I'll see you in Watertown soon.
I know we're crossing our fingers that our local government conference will be held next year in March. So,
all right. Those who I already knew, good seeing you again. Those who I don't, which is the vast majority of you, nice to see you, such as it was.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everybody.
Yep. Good night.